Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pam Lack. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Digital Humanities Librarian and director of the now virtual Digital Humanities Center here at San Diego State University. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to the first of our spring virtual workshops. This is a two-part series on the ethics of data and data science with a recent San Diego State alum, who I'll introduce in just a minute. But before I do that, I want to take a moment to read our land acknowledgement for San Diego State. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. And I'll put the link to our land acknowledgement in chat in just a moment. I'll also put a bunch of other links into chat, including information about the DH Center for those of you who are new to us, as well as a link to all of our virtual spring programs that we're hosting this semester, as well as links to recordings of all of our previous events from the fall. One benefits of being virtual and running virtual events is that we can produce archives and artifacts of our events that folks can access at their leisure. But with that, I'll just go ahead and dive in by introducing our fantastic instructor, someone I've worked with very closely for quite a while, Brianne Hayes. Brianne holds a BS in Applied Mathematics from San Diego State University, and will be beginning their PhD in English next fall. University still to be determined. They're still weighing their options. They've worked as a data scientist for organizations including the Port of San Diego and the Information Sciences Institute at USC. Their research focuses on the intersection of the digital with issues of gender and sexuality. So with that, please join me in welcoming Brianne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. I am really excited to be able to talk to you about ethics of data science, which is something I'm very invested in. Let me go ahead and share my screen so you can, and let me go ahead and start this presentation. And okay. All right. And so as Pam mentioned, this is the first of two parts. You don't have to attend the second one, although if you do, that would be great. They are related, but also independent of one another. In this session, we're going to be focus on getting data, as in the first thing you need to do in data science, have data to work with. And we're going to talk about how to do so in an ethical manner. We're going to talk through how to think about data in an ethical and critical way. So before I get started, the slides for this presentation are available at the link there. I recommend saving that link somewhere. I know Pam should have posted it in the chat already, because everything I'm going to mention in this presentation, from news stories to websites and resources, are all linked in the presentation itself. So take that link down. I'll give you a second just to grab that if you haven't already. And we'll jump in here. So quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, some framing questions of what and why with data science. What even is data science? It's a kind of a buzzword, and we want to sort of demystify what the practice is. Why the need for ethical data science? What are the ethics we have to think about? And some framing questions to kind of guide us as we start engaging in thinking about data. Then thinking about data, so introducing some key terms, including data and Capta. What's the difference there? What even is Capta? And then the ideas of abstraction, categorization, reductionism, when we're talking about data, especially data that's derived from humans, so most data. And then in the second half of the presentation, we're going to dive into some more technical aspects of acquiring data. So first, we're going to talk about ways to find pre-existing data sets. Then we're going to talk about ways you can make your own data sets. And we're going to close with some best practices and some general summary of the principles that we're talking about here today. So first, the conceptual stuff, or thinking about getting data. I want to start off with some Venn diagrams about data science, because there are a lot of these actually. This is kind of the original. It was made by Drew Conway in 2010, but it was published in 2013 and kind of became a big thing and sparked a something of a movement of people making Venn diagrams to explain what data science is. Drew Conway has a pretty decent functional definition of data science as an intersection between hacking skills, which basically means programming and the ability to work with computer systems, not just illegal hacking. Substantive expertise, which people have interpreted as, sort of real world experience or business experience or field knowledge of a specific fields like linguistics or physics, for example, and math and statistics knowledge, which is pretty straightforward. Important thing that I want to point out here is notice that the intersection of hacking skills and substantive expertise is defined as the danger zone. We'll get back to that in a little bit. So on to the next diagram here. Oh, let's see, there we go. Here's one somewhat by Stephen Kolassa that expands the original 3 circles from Conway's diagram with the 4th one, communication, and defines the perfect data science as the intersection of all 4 of those things. A couple other things to note here is we see that substantive expertise has been replaced by business, which already is moving the concept of data science away from a intellectual endeavor or an academic endeavor and focusing entirely on something that you'd see in a business setting. And also, I just kind of find it funny that the communication circle is just labeled hot air, but we can overlook that. Then there's this one by Brendan Tierney, which I mostly wanted to show off because it's such a chaotic mess. If you can comprehend what exactly that he is going for with this Venn diagram, I congratulate you. But there are some interesting things to pull out here. First, notice it's kind of been that the idea of data science has kind of been extended into 2 categories. There's the inner circle, which is technical techniques or technical products. And the outer circle, which is more sort of the business practices. So this is once again notice the way that business practices is surrounding everything. And so it's when we are moving further into understanding data science as a business endeavor, where all this stuff is kind of encapsulated by the needs of business. And finally, this Joel Gress diagram, which is just the original Drew Conway diagram with a couple modifications, one being the addition of an evil circle, and the other being that the danger zone has been removed, with that not that dangerous in retrospect. And I think this is kind of, I wanted to build up to this because this idea is kind of key. That I think what Drew Conway's diagram expressed that the other ones have kind of moved away from is that it is really, really easy to do bad with data science. And the fact that this diagram interestingly makes that both explicit and sort of separates off the responsibility of doing good by putting data science outside of the evil circle and having evil be its own thing. As we'll see, and as we'll talk about, it is entirely possible for there to be, quote, evil, and that is misrepresentation, that is bias, that is prejudice in data science without evil intent. And we're going to talk about that some more. So all this together, what exactly is data science? What have we learned from these Venn diagrams? We saw that there's a lot of focus on business practice. We saw there's a lot of focus on a couple of different various technical skills. So what are we talking about here? Is it a set of skills? Is it buzzwords? Is it business? Is it good or evil? Is it, as David Taylor said, quipped, the field of people who decide to print data scientist on their business cards and get a salary bump? And the reality is data science is nebulous. It's a very broad interdisciplinary field that is that can be good and bad. There's room to do very good in data and there's room to do very bad in data. And something that we see a lot in practicing professional data science is that issues of ethics and morality and of a critical approach to data are sort of put by the wayside. A lot of tech people who know how to do data science, who have the technical skills and the position to access data and perform data analysis, are incentivized not really to think about it. They're mostly they just want to get the work done. And today we're going to think about data science. We're going to think about it critically. And we're going to think about how to do it in ways that are not going to be evil for the world. And something that I want to really hammer in is that obviously everyone who's here today is here because they want to learn about data science. And data science, once again, it is kind of a buzzword. It's a big thing. It's really powerful, but it's also not the only solution. I see a lot of organizations nowadays sort of throwing resources at data-driven solutions. out of this sort of assumption that it's a catch-all solution. And it certainly seems appealing when you can just gather a large data set of information about your organization, throw it at a neural network, and get something that looks like results that might tell you something. But if you do it in that kind of straightforward, uncritical way, all sorts of complications can arise. And so I want to sort of forewarn before anyone even like, if you decide to bring big data into your project, you need to think about why. Why do I think that a data-driven approach is right for this project? What is it going to add? What is it going to take away? What are the risks involved? Instead of just throwing it in there because it seems useful, we need to start by thinking, do I even want to do this in the first place, and why? So now moving on to the ethics of data science. We've kind of already been talking about this, but I wanted to have some specific examples of how data science, or just AI, as it's often referred to by a lot of mainstream media, can go awry. You've probably seen things like these before, but I wanted to just kind of reinforce the problems of data. Here's a good one: Airbnb patenting software to identify narcissists and psychopaths to prevent them from using their platform. This, I hopefully it's pretty easy to imagine how digging through people's social media to make judgments about their personality as to whether or not they can use a service can be very exploitative, can be very prejudiced in ways that might have not occurred to people who designed this platform in the first place. There was another interesting story about Amazon using automated recruiting tools, looking through people's social media and their LinkedIns and whatnot to see whether they would be a good fit for Amazon, and heavily favoring very masculine traits, like very aggressive masculine language, and showing bias against any mentions of feminine identity or feminine coded language. And then I think this one speaks for itself. Google fixed its racist algorithm by removing gorillas from its image labeling tech. I hopefully don't need to explain what the problem there was. Yeah, clearly data science is these are all sort of emergent prejudices from relatively straightforward projects. And were the people on these projects thinking about data critically when they did these? Probably not. They might have been, but they obviously weren't. They obviously had to backtrack and change things along the way. And so these are hopefully the sort of emergent problems that we'll be avoiding after this presentation. I do want to, at this point, clarify this is not a big data is evil talk. I think that data science is extremely useful and interesting. There's a lot we can do with it. I'm not trying to warn you off from doing it. I just really want to reiterate that we need to think about why we want to do data science, and we need to, when we do data science, we need to think about doing it critically. And so just to reinforce this idea that it's not all bad, there are some good things that data has done, obviously. This is one of my favorite examples from a PBS article talking about using machine learning on the internet to fight human trafficking. That image there, I don't know if you can recognize pretty much anything in it. I mean, there looks like there might be like a chair and a person, but it's very, very blurry, clearly. This is one of the images that some agents who were attempting to, some agents both public and private, were attempting to fight human trafficking, used as part of a data set to recognize the location. Like, they're basically, what I'm saying is computers might, a well-trained algorithm might be able to recognize what's in this photo where we cannot. And that's just something that was used to help identify the locations of human traffickers, which is a notoriously difficult thing to do on the internet. And other interesting things that it can do, there is an increasing amount of data generated or computer generated art. This is a really recent example, Golem by Nick Montfort. It just came out like a couple days ago, I think. It's a computer generated novel. It's fascinating. And Nick Montfort has a lot of work like this. You should check him out if you have not done so already. This is just one example of what you can, of an interesting, thoughtful use of data that really adds something to the world without kind of and complicates it in a way that isn't inherently biased or prejudiced or unethical. So anyway, to kind of sum up with this first section with some questions to frame our overall discussion. Why do I want to use data science? What benefits and complications does data science add to this project? Is the significance of my use of data commensurate to my confidence that I use the data well? And that's kind of what I mean by that is when I'm using data, is the amount that the data component is adding to this project, does that track with my ability to represent the data fairly and to do good work with the data. Like is there if you have a very, very heavily database project, you want to be sure that you're confident that you're using data well. And what opportunities might I be opening up or closing for others with this project? And I think most importantly, does my data fairly reflect reality and its subjectivity, I should have added, or is it just or does it present your version of reality as fact? So thinking about data now, we've I want to introduce some, now that we've kind of framed the discussion around data science, I want to introduce some ideas about thinking about data as kind of from a conceptual lens and how we can reconceptualize data to be a little more representative of the humans that it's often taken from. So a question you'll probably often hear in reference to data science is, what does the data say? You might have a problem in your workplace setting or in one of your projects, and someone might just be like, oh, let's just go look at the data. What does it say? Data doesn't say anything. Data doesn't speak. Data is information. We have to use it to speak with data. Data itself is not an argument, although its presence might be an argument. But as soon as we look at the data, we're going to be formulating arguments about what that data means, and those are subjective judgments. So to kind of, I think Joanna Drucker, who wrote a fantastic book called Graphesis, which is predominantly about data visualization, but also talks about data in the abstract. She did a really interesting job of kind of differentiating data from the idea of Capta, which is a much less well-known subject idea. And I say it's less well-known because I Googled it and I got a bunch of acronyms for things that use Capta as an acronym, and I couldn't actually find this definition here. So anyway, Drucker defines Capta as a systematic expression of information understood as constructed as phenomena perceived according to principles of interpretation. Breaking that down, what exactly does that mean? It basically means that Capta is taken while data is given. So if we're conceptualizing information as data, we're basically saying this is a given fact about reality. Like this data point or set of data points that I have are unfalsifiable, they are verifiable, they are true, and they have been given to me for me to use with them, for me to use them however I want. Capta, meanwhile, is taken. When we think about data as Capta, we're basically conceptualizing the information we're getting from the world as, okay, there's stuff out there, and I am taking information about this stuff, but I'm taking it in such a way that includes my own biases, my own prejudices. And so that this data that I'm acquiring, this Capta that I'm acquiring, does not necessarily reflect reality as is, but my own version of reality. And Drucker repeats again and again that we need to conceptualize all data as Capta, so that when we're working with data, we are maintaining the subjective nature of our arguments, of our statements with data, instead of presenting the data like it's some unfalsifiable truth of your argument. There's some proof of your argument. Now, this is a really I just love this line. This is a mistranslation from the Japanese from a game called Castlevania. What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. And I think I wanted to include this because I feel like this, ironically, the statement that Dracula of all people is saying is sort of how a lot of large corporations nowadays that use data address people. We want to think of, if you just replace secrets with data points, you might understand what I'm getting at. And this leads us into the problems of abstraction, categorization, and reductionism. When we're working with data, we are necessarily abstracting from reality by picking points of information that we think might be useful. We are necessarily categorizing reality by deciding which variables of reality we want to measure and which we don't. And reductionism, because when we are taking pinpoints of reality, we can't take everything, and we have to pick what we're taking, and this necessarily reduces our subjects down to something less than their full truth. So we're reducing men down to miserable little piles of secrets, essentially. And so these are things that we need to be really careful about when we're designing data projects. Oh, sorry about that. As Drucker says, the basic categories of supposedly quantitative information are already interpreted expressions. What does that mean? Well, let's take an example. I'm non-binary. I don't identify as a man or a woman, but a lot of data sets, when they include a gender variable, they're only going to include male or female. If you only include male or female as options for gender identity, you are inherently in the design of your data, before you've even gathered any data, you are categorizing out a vast swath of human experience. And so when you're collecting data, we need to, and you're designing these categories and you're figuring out, how do I abstract reality in a way that's going to be useful for me? We need to keep in mind a couple key questions. Would a subject, being, you know, a person or a thing, whatever it is I'm taking the data from, would it feel represented by the way I'm abstracting it? Do my categories include important context? Like, if I'm, say, working with data that includes countries, and do my categories of countries include contested or unrecognized territories and nations? Are we leaving room for error in our categories? And are we treating data as Capta is the most important thing. And a little extra credit for anyone who wants to go back and look at those Venn diagrams through the lens of Capta and kind of do the analysis I did with a little closer eye. There's a lot of fun things to kind of note about them. I love those Venn diagrams. I don't know what it is. They're fascinating, and there's tons more online. I wish I could have included all of them in the presentation, and they get increasingly more bizarre and ridiculous, and it's just a lot of fun. Anyway, so feel free to go back in the slides and look at those later if you'd like. So now that we've kind of conceptually framed data, we've talked about Capta, we've talked about the ethics of data science, and we have an idea of what things you might want to look out for when we're collecting data. Now let's get into the technical stuff, or getting the data itself. Nothing in this presentation is going to be super technical. This isn't a programming workshop. This isn't a hands-on workshop. Essentially, what I'm going to do here is overview a big collection of resources and techniques you can use to gather data online. And I should specify that in terms of getting data, this isn't talking about experimentation or, you know, getting data through research the old-fashioned way. This is getting data that already exists out there, which comes with its own pitfalls, and we'll talk about that. So probably the easiest way to go about finding data for your project is just to find a data set that has already been assembled. There are tons of them online, representing a huge variety of subjects, and you can, so why would you want to use a pre-made data set? Well, one, it's already made, it's easy, you don't have to do the work aside from finding it. If it was built professionally, you can usually find ones that are very high quality and hard to replicate, that might consist of thousands or tens of thousands or millions of observations that you as an individual, or you with your organization, might struggle to replicate. And you also, with data sets that already exist, there are examples of other applications of those data sets. So you can look at what other people have done with the data already, and you can build off of their work. Cons of using pre-made data sets: you don't have any say in the design or the collection of the data, and you might lose context. So basically, this is, again, thinking about data as Capta. If you download a Excel spreadsheet that contains 1 million observations about people's shopping habits, for example, you have no idea. You might not, unless someone has written a very extensive documentation for you, you might not have any idea of the context that went into those shopping habits. Like, when was the information gathered? Kind of who were these subjects selected out of? Are the categories that are in the data set representative categories or not? You don't have any say in that. You might not even know. So always be careful when using pre-existing data sets, and look at the quality of the data before you decide to use it. Format, this is a more of a technical issue. You might find data that is not in a shape that you can use it most easily, and you might then have to reshape it, which is a bit of a hassle. I won't go too deep into that, but you can, if you have any data that you need reshaped, you can feel free to reach out to me, and I can talk to you about that, what that process looks like. And then missing data sets and availability bias, we will talk about at the end of this section, but that's a really important, but just keep that in. Essentially, not all data sets that exist are all the data that exists, obviously. So keep that in mind, and we'll talk a bit more about that after we go through some places to find data sets. So a couple of major resources: there's Datagov, which has high quality government data. Topics are pretty limited because this is only data that's gathered by public agencies, and as well as it's only data gathered by public agencies that they have then decided to make public. And the way that data is represented can be very obtuse for non-specialists. If you go to data.gov and look at their climate data, unless you're a climate scientist, you're probably not going to know what to do with a lot of the information that's in there. But the data is high quality, and there's a lot of it. Data.world has a huge diversity of data sets. But the problem is they're mostly user contributed. So in terms of the quality of the data and the way it's documented can vary very widely. Plus, the website itself is corporate oriented. While you can make a free account and download data sets for free, they are predominantly trying to sell larger organizations a database product. And so you might run into some problems using the website there, or some limitations using the website because of that. Kaggle, you may have heard of before. It's one of the kind of big websites in the data world. It was originally and it still predominantly is, a competition platform. Essentially, organizations would sponsor a Kaggle competition and then present a data set, and then ask people to solve some problem using that data set, using machine learning and deep learning and AI and data science and all this. And then they'd pay out cash prizes, which is pretty cool. I have a lot to say about Kaggle, which is not sort of appropriate for this particular presentation. All I will say is that the competition angle does sort of contribute to a environment of not thinking about data in terms of usefulness, but thinking about it in terms of, okay, how well can I build a model that's going to score really high on a prediction test? And so there's a kind of even though oftentimes real world data is being used, there is a lot of Kaggle kind of tends to abstract away and think of data in terms of machine learning problems only. However, there are a lot of interesting data sets. The data sets are collaborative, so you can see data sets that have been voted up by other people that might be of high quality. People who post data sets can ask for improvements, can ask for modifications. There's a lot of really good stuff on Kaggle, and you don't have to look at the competition side at all. So it's a good place to look for data. Reddit has a ton of subreddits that are devoted to posting data sets. And if you're not finding something that you think should exist, you can always ask for it, and somebody might be able to find it. That being said, it's because it's a forum. That being said, it is difficult to search because the data sets are spread across multiple subreddits, and Reddit has some cultural problems in terms of being predominantly white male dominated and very politically oriented towards the right, and lots of other stuff. This is not a problem that's pervasive on every subreddit, but it is sort of just an overall problem with Reddit. So just, be extra careful with any sort of culturally or politically sensitive data that you're sourcing from there, because you might not be able to be sure it's representative. There is a Google dataset search tool that I only learned about recently somehow. I don't know if it is recent or if I just somehow had never heard of it before. But this is a really interesting service that allows you to sort of do a meta search of lots of different data sets. It's best for broad queries. So if you want to look for transportation data, if you want to look for data of literary history, you can just search those terms in there, and Google will pull up some possible data sets for you. A nice thing about it is that it prioritizes data sets that have been used in peer-reviewed research, meaning that it's likely that the data you're going to pull up is going to be of higher quality than stuff you might find on Kaggle or Data.world. That being said, there's no guarantee the stuff you're finding isn't going to be paywalled or even accessible. A lot of times, actually, individuals cite data sets that are not publicly available. They had to get access to in some other way. And so it might be helpful. The data set search might be helpful for finding whether a data set exists. It may be less helpful for actually giving you access to that data set, but still, it's a good tool for searching. And one last thing I want to plug is Data is Plural, which is something that Pam introduced me to the other day. It's a newsletter. So it's a weekly newsletter that sends out a compilation of interesting data sets, and it has a complete archive. The link that I have there will take you to where all of the recorded data sets are. They're chronological, which is pretty cool. So you can see sort of how people's thinking about data has evolved in the last couple of years, has a lot of diverse topics, and gives multiple sources for the data sets. But it's not great for searching. So it's another reason. It's not a fantastic resource, but it is a really interesting one. And if you're interested in working with data, it's a good place to get kind of fun data sets to test your skills on. And I couldn't find a logo or anything, so I just wanted to show this fun little comic over on the left here, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. Just got the 3 here. Okay. So now let's talk about these problem of missing data sets, which I alluded to a little bit at the beginning of this portion of the presentation. So it shouldn't be any surprise that systemic issues in who funds data collection project means that there are gaps in what's available. we can find lots of pre-existing data sets that might be useful, but that raises the question, what sorts of data sets haven't already been collected? The link there takes you to a GitHub page that was created by Mimi Onuoha, which is a really interesting sort of look at what data sets might not be out there and the problem of missing data sets. Especially when we're dealing with data about marginalized groups, it's easy to see how there just might not be data available. And then it also raises the question of is gathering this data something we actually want to do? A lot of people in the data world talk about wanting to gather as much data as possible. There's this saying I've heard used before, which is n equals all, which is basically saying that our data models are perfect because we have all of the data. Like we have like a whole data set for every person on the planet, so our models can't be perfect, which is one, not true, and two, do we really want to gather as much data as possible about every person on the planet? Probably not. There's a lot of problems with that. That you can immediately think about. And so missing data sets are an interesting sort of hole in the world of existing data sets. They create the problem of availability bias, which means that if a problem has an associated data set that already exists, that problem is more likely to attract potential solutions. And so if you're dealing with a problem that requires data that would be categorized with one of these missing data sets or just otherwise isn't available, you have to ask yourself, why isn't this data set available? Should it be available? Can I make it happen? Do I want to make it happen? Is it necessary for my project? All sorts of questions arise there. And a couple guidelines when using pre-existing data sets, just general guidance for anything you pull off of any of those websites. Verify the origin of the data if possible. It's not always possible, and sometimes you kind of have to just look through it yourself and decide whether it seems like fair data. But if you can figure out where and how the data was gathered and understand the context, that is going to make it much easier for you to engage with the data critically. Think about who's providing the data and why. Think about how the data is structured and presented, and think about what the data might be missing out, might be leaving out. So now we're going to move on to the most technical section of this presentation, which is making your own data sets. As I said earlier, this is not going to be making your own data sets as in performing experiments and collecting data. This is making data sets as in looking at existing repositories of data, but that haven't been collected into a usable data set form, and designing a data set based on that. Obviously the biggest advantage doing it this way to kind of acquiring data from the world and then structuring it how you want is you have complete control over design and collection strategy. You can decide how much data you need and only what you need. You know the context in which the data was gathered. You select the categories, all sorts of it lets you really directly engage with a lot of the questions that we've been thinking about here today. The cons of this, it's really difficult. It frequently requires a decent amount of technical skill. You're going to have to learn how to use new tools. There will be complications. There will be documentation that is poor. All sorts of problems arise. And also the responsibility of building an ethical data set now falls on you. You don't have the luxury of being able to look at a bad data set and being like, well, it's not a great data set, but it's all that we have. You shouldn't be doing that anyway, but if you did do that, you could at least blame someone else. This time, if you build a data set and it is not representative of the subjects that the data is based upon, that's on you. And so you have to think really hard. When you make your own data set, you have to put a lot of work in before you even start collecting the information to decide whether your data set design is going to contribute to a more ethical, more critical perspective of the problem you're looking at with the data. And so the tool I'm going to be talking about for acquiring data in this way is public REST APIs. REST API stands for Representable State Transfer Application Programming Interface. You don't need to know the acronym. I didn't even know what REST API stood for until I made this presentation, even though I've been working with them for years. What a REST API does is allow you to collect data from a source via HTTPS, which is a standardized internet communication protocol. Standardized is the key word there, meaning that once you learn how to do it for one service or one source of information, you can pretty easily do it for other sources of information by slightly modifying your requests. We'll get into specifically what that means. You can specify what you're gathering, how much. You have a lot of variables that you get to set. It does depend on the source of the information that you're gathering data from, but you have a lot more control than if you're just downloading a pre-existing spreadsheet. So a couple websites that have public REST APIs, and this is not a representative list at all. This is just a couple ones that I either are big or funny. There's Twitter, which is one I get asked about a lot. Twitter has a public API that lets you gather tweets. There is, especially in the humanities, there is a ton of room for research on tweet data. And so if nothing else, if you're taking nothing else away from this, hopefully you will know where to start with gathering information from Twitter. There are also REST APIs for Spotify, for information relating to music, Merriam-Webster's Dictionary, the Anime News Network, Google Earth, New York Times, NASA, and just tons more. That link there links you to a, will take you to a web page that has about 100 different REST APIs available that you can try out. Some for fun, some are fun just for fun. Some are really interesting and have a lot of data associated with them. And so if you learn how to use a REST API, you're going to have access to a lot more data than you would have had previously. So how do you use a REST API? That's a good question. So essentially what you're doing is you're sending an HTTPS request or an API request, which looks something like that. So that's a lot of numbers and kind of jargon. Essentially what this is doing is this is a request from the Twitter's documentation for Twitter's public REST API that is basically asking Twitter to retrieve these 3 specific tweets. These are tweet IDs right here. And it's only asking to retrieve the fields when the tweet was created, who the author is, and and who the author is. And so there's a lot of symbols and stuff in there, but if you break it down to its parts, you see Twitter, you see tweets, you see the tweet IDs, you see the fields. It's pretty easy to see how you might go about structuring a REST API request. And the nice thing is that most of the major services, especially Twitter, have very detailed guides on how to structure your API requests and how to use them. So if that link there will take you to Twitter's page, which is a good place to start as any for learning how to use REST APIs. A note for Twitter is that you have to verify yourself as a user first, which involves like kind of some back and forth with Twitter, but it's a pretty automated process. It might take a little bit of time. But if you have any information in gathering information from any interest in gathering information from Twitter, this is a great place to start. And there are also plenty of tools that exist to help with to make the crafting of these API requests less intimidating. For example, Postman is one that I like personally. It basically takes the sort of it breaks down the structuring of an API request into a bunch of different categories and makes it, and also in addition to that, there are plugins for Postman that will hook you up automatically to some of the major APIs like Twitter. And so if you're going to, so if you want to learn how to do this, I recommend downloading Postman, going through the Twitter documentation and walking through their sort of introductory stuff. And hopefully that the sort of initially intimidating API requests that I showed you here will start to make more sense. You'll be able to craft more complicated ones and start building data sets of your own. So in summary, overall, just what did we learn today? Hopefully a lot. I know I went at sort of a rapid clip and there was a lot of ground to cover. I really encourage everyone to look back over the slides and kind of peruse the resources that I presented yourself. But to kind of summarize, thinking about data critically, know why you're using data before you decide to use data. Conceptualize all data as Capta, that is as taken information, that is as subjective information. Do not lose context. If you're gathering data, keep the context in mind and document it as much as possible because data is only as good as its context. If you don't know the context with data that you're finding that already exists, find it if you can. It's very hard to use. I mean, it's not hard. You can use data that doesn't have context, but it's hard to do so in a critical manner because you have no idea what that data might be excluding in addition to what it's including. The way that's easy is often easy for a reason. When I say easy here, I kind of mean going about. That was the danger zone way at the beginning of this presentation. The ability to hack together something that works, but that might not be representative. That might be using data in an unethical way. this thinking about data is hard. On top of having to do a lot of technical work, you also are now having to kind of wring yourself through these humanistic and ethical problems of and it's a lot of people would just prefer not to do that, but it's important that we do that, because we see what happens when we use data unethically and uncritically. You get things like Google calling African American people gorillas. So the easy way is often easy for a reason. When you're looking at data, think about what isn't in the data, and always remember that there's some data that really shouldn't be collected. So that's it. That's the presentation. Obviously, we have time for questions. If you want to keep in touch, there's my Twitter and my personal website, and my email is available in the presentation as well. I'm going to go ahead and close out the screen share now. Thank you all so much for listening. And yeah, I would love to take any questions if you have any.
And I'll just say folks can either post questions in chat and I can read them, or if you want to, you can unmute yourself and just ask your question if you're comfortable doing that.
I don't even know what question to ask, actually. But since there's so few people here, I'll just shout out without being called on. The one reason I was attracted to this seminar, which was really interesting and very informative. Thank you very much. And I look forward to grabbing the slides so I can click on those different links. So in this COVID situation we're in, my research deals with real people face to face, and we've been having some struggles, of course, for good reasons to do that. Over the summer, I was working on a project that had to do with vaccine apprehensions in anticipation of the COVID vaccine coming out. And so I was probably in the danger zone. I just went on, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and kind of looked at what I could find. And so I'm hoping that when I download the slides and grab some of these tools, I can figure out a way to do that more systematically. Recently, I've become involved in a project that is focused on, well, I'll just cut to the chase, individuals using WhatsApp. So it's another social media platform, I suppose. Does that particular platform, for want of a better word, does that lend itself to any of this kind of API search or what have you?
Let me check real quick. I actually have no idea at the top of my head.
Thinking about what you said about exclusion, right? If we just look at Facebook, we're excluding whole groups of people. Yeah,
I know that. Yeah, Facebook has does not have an API as far as I'm aware, at least not a public one. There is a so I just looked it up. WhatsApp is a closed system, so there's no APIs. It's like Facebook. They kind of are keeping their. The unfortunate thing about APIs is that and this is again a problem of representation and exclusion, is that the company needs to decide that they want to give a public facing API in order for that to exist. It's not some backend into the existing into the data. It's a kindness, which I hate to phrase it that way, but I mean, and oftentimes it's not just a kindness, because it exists for business purposes, because a lot of large organizations use these APIs to build products and whatnot that then the providers profit off of. But the fact that we as individuals can use it is a kindness. It's helpful, and so that's so WhatsApp does not have an API. Facebook does not have an API. Twitter does have an API. What does that say about each organization? In terms of, if you ever are wondering, does X have an API? If you just Google the name of the company or the name of the service and then API or REST API or public API, you can usually find it if it exists. And then, I think, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's sort of, it is an interesting point that, not everything does. A lot of stuff does, not everything does. And things that don't, it does raise questions about exclusion. And you always have to think, can I actually get all the data from this website using their API, even they're offering it, or what is being left out here? You kind of have to, it lets you get a more direct access than you'd see on like for example, your Twitter feed, which is highly algorithmically sorted and represented. The API is a lot more direct, but still has its issues of exclusion and leaving out context. So.
Well, and to follow up on that, that raises the question that I've thought about a long time, particularly related to the Twitter API, which is that, people know that Twitter is public, right? It's not like on Facebook where you can control who sees your posts to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
But just because that my tweets are public, does that mean that I put them out there with the intent of being used in a very different way or a different context? And what are the ethics of that? And I don't know if that's something we want to explore or can explore in the time we have left, but it's just a question that's kind of nagged at me. And I've asked it of folks who use Twitter data as their primary source of data for their research. And I have not gotten good answers from when asking that question in context.
Yeah. Twitter is an interesting case study because it's such a large, it's such a unique platform in a lot of ways, and the fact that so many people are on it and that so many researchers are interested in gathering data to look at, because it's sort of like, if you want to get, like, say, the public opinion on something, what can you do? You can take a poll, or if you don't have the resources to take a poll, you can gather a lot of tweets and then read the tweets. Which is, and I have a background in natural language processing, and it's something that we did a lot in that, because it's really easy it's comparatively really easy to do. But as you said, Pam, it raises the question of, like, well, when I'm putting stuff on Twitter, I sort of had this, I have this awareness that I'm putting it out to the world to see, but also, like, I'm in my kind of Twitter bubble because I have this algorithmically selected timeline that makes me feel like the only people who are going to see this are a couple of my followers and friends who are kind of like in this almost like, it almost feels like a digital community, even though it's not, you haven't like explicitly opted into it. It's sort of like it's sort of an emergent thing. And so, yeah, you might be surprised to then find your tweets that you thought were not private, but were only going to be seen by a couple people, suddenly included in a data set that's being used in academic research. And it's an issue of, technically people have opted into this by making it public, but is it okay for us to be using that? Maybe not, probably not, especially with again, especially with there are a lot of marginalized communities who use Twitter to communicate, and I don't know how happy they would be to know that all of their kind of communications to each other are being taken down and sorted and categorized and used to make conclusions about them by academics.
There have been a couple comments and questions coming through in chat. I'll read one of the questions and then also point out to folks who aren't following, who don't have chat open, that there are some links to resources, including a library guide by my colleague Margaret on specialized data repositories. But one of our participants asks, how do you deal with missing data or data that have errors? What's your approach? Then as a follow-up question with sort of data ethics and privacy, thinking about the CCPA and GDPR and sort of implications for that. Those are sort of two unrelated points and questions.
So the question of missing data is a really, really interesting one. And there's kind of two ways to answer it. The first way is the way that a lot of statistics and data textbooks would do it, which is sort of techniques to fudge the numbers almost, because there are mathematical and statistical techniques that you can use to, if you have holes in your data set, to kind of fill them in based on what's around it, or you can exclude information in systematic ways to be able to get cumulative figures and stuff. So that's like the quantitative way to do it. But that raises the problems for the qualitative way, which is you're basically what these solutions do is they pretend that there's not missing data. You just kind of you're lying basically. You're when you're filling in a data point with an average based on surrounding data points, you're making stuff up. It might be a good guess, and if you're dealing with something like climate data or income data for like not income but like corporate income data, like projecting prices of stuff, which is something that I worked on for once, it might be okay. But if you're talking about people are highly complex, and you might not, and you probably can't predict a aspect of a person's personality based on those of them surrounding them. I mean, maybe, but that's then again, there's a question of can and should, and you probably could do it, but you probably shouldn't be doing it. And so I think that to answer your question directly, how do you deal with missing data or data has errors? Make those missing points and make those errors very explicit. Like in your project, explain that, like, hey, I couldn't get this big chunk of data was missing. Hey, like there's this chunk of data that looks like it's off, like something is wrong here. Try to interrogate the sources of that, like, why is the information missing? Why is there an error if you can? And then if you're doing quantitative analysis, you might have to then use some of those techniques of exclusion or averaging or what have you to be able to make conclusions. But you have to make explicitly clear in your presentation of this, like, hey, there are these problems, and we need to think about why these problems are there in the first place. You can't just ignore them. In the second part of this workshop, which will be next week, we're going to talk about a lot about data visualization. And I'm going to talk about ways to include ideas of uncertainty or missing data in visualizations. And so again, to kind of express and make clear like that this data set is not perfect. So if that's something you're interested in seeing more of, I would definitely recommend coming to or watching the recording of next week's presentation. In terms of CCPA and GDPR, I can't really speak to those personally. I don't have a ton of I don't have a ton of information on those, so it is definitely a conversation to be had. But I'm maybe not the person to start that conversation. Yeah, of course. It's a really good question because yeah, it's I have dealt in my previous data work. I have dealt with a lot of missing data, and it is interesting how to see how different people want you to handle those situations.
I have another question if no one else does. Brianne, your slide on missing data was really intriguing to me, and we actually talked about it earlier this week. But in particular, one of the statements that you had about resistance to data collection or the lack of a data set as a form of resistance. And how some communities might want to resist data collection. We could even see that in the most recent census count. But in a world that is so data driven and everyone talks about data driven solutions and like that's somehow a panacea for all of our social problems, can you sort of unpack that a little bit about how communities might want to resist being quantified, but also sort of the good and the bad of that a little bit?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time it comes down to who is doing the quantification and for what. Because I think it's very different if you're talking about, say, the queer community. If you have queer researchers who are trying to research the community and figure out, like, for example, one project that I've been working on deals with the responses of a queer community in Canada to COVID, and how they've kind of how social networks have evolved under the pandemic, and this is a project that's being led by a trans researcher and has plenty of people like me who are queer identified to consult on it. That being said, when we gather that data, if we then make it public, it's very, very easy for someone who has no connection to the queer community to then take it down and make conclusions about us with it, which is scary. And so that it is always that's really the risk whenever you're gathering data. You kind of want to sometimes you might want to gather the data for genuinely good purposes, but then knowing that you might have to make it public then puts people at a risk, because even if you gather data just for yourself, there is always like a pressure to kind of publicize data, because we want things to be open, we want people to have access to information, we want people to be able to verify our work through our data. At the same time, though, it's risky if another person can get hands on it and manipulate it and misuse it. And so sometimes the best way is just resistance to data collection, just to be like, no, we're not going to be quantified. We don't need to be quantified. Like, there are let's try other solutions first, instead of jumping to, hey, let's measure every aspect of our lives and hand it over to some big organization so that they can maybe do something with that information. Let's actually try other solutions to our particular problems first before we feel the need to quantify everything about ourselves and ship that data off to be analyzed. The problem with a lot of rhetoric around big data and data science, I feel, is that it's sort of, thank you, Margaret, is that something I feel is that it sort of, what do I want to say here? The prevalence of data science and the way that people have, like you said, Pam, that we kind of treat data science and AI as a panacea to everything, is that we realize that there are other solutions to things. We don't need to use data to solve problems, but we want to jump there because it's such an appealing solution. And that's what I mean when I say that big data and data science is a buzzword. We need to kind of resist that and think about things that honestly are probably better than using data to solve our problems. So that was kind of a messy answer, but hopefully that makes sense. It's just yeah, don't jump to data collection unless you have to, or you think there's a really good reason to do so. And when you are collecting data, always be careful of what others can do with that data further down the line.
Great, thank you so much. And that was actually a fantastic answer to my question. We're just about out of time. I don't know if there's any last questions, but if not, please join me in thanking Brienne for this really thought-provoking workshop. And I look forward to the second part next Friday. I've put the link to register in chat, as well as a link to our feedback form, so you can let us know what you thought of today's workshop. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I hope that you continue to be safe and healthy and well in this ongoing pandemic. So thank you, and again, have a great weekend.
You as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.